In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural solar panels material in Blender. And I will be using Cycle's render engine in this tutorial, but you could totally use Eevee as well. This material also works really well in the Eevee engine. So here's the material in Blender's real-time rendering engine, Blender Eevee, and it looks really nice as well. So I'm going to be using Cycle's because Cycle's is more realistic, but you could totally do this in Eevee as well. If you'd like to purchase this procedural material as well as help support the channel, then you can do that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase more of my procedural materials, you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs. So they're packs of 10 realistic procedural materials created with Blender's procedural nodes. Again, links will be in the description where you can purchase on my Gumroad store. And that is also a great way to help support this channel. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. So before we create the material, I wanted to show you what I have set up in the 3D space. So I pressed Shift A and I went here to mesh and I added a plane. And then once I added the plane, I rotated it on the X-axis by 90 degrees. And so this way the plane is pointed forwards. And then I also added a camera here and I pointed the camera at the plane and I kind of rotated it to the side a little bit so it would catch a little bit of the reflections. And then for the lighting, I added in this area light right here. So I just set this to a square and I made it really big and bright. I set the power to 3000 and then I just left this as a bright white color. And this is going to help to give some reflections to those solar panels. And then to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, right over here on the world properties, I added in this Photo Studio Broadway Hall 1K HDR. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com and I'll have the link in the description if you'd like to download it. So I downloaded the 1K HDR version of this HDRI. And when you add a new world, you can click here on the yellow dot next to the color, and then you can go right here to environment texture, just choose the environment texture, and then you can click on open to open up the HDRI. And then in the rendered view, you can see that the background is transparent. And so if you want the background to be transparent, then you can click right over here to the render properties, and then you can open up the film tab right here. And then you can just click on the transparent button, and that way you can't see the HDRI in the background. And then to make the colors and lighting look a little bit nicer, I set the view transform to filmic and the look here to a very high contrast. And this is right here in the color management settings in the render properties. So I have the 3D space right here and I'm in the rendered view. And then I also have the shader editor right here. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on in this tutorial. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can just click right up here on edit and go to the preferences and then click over there on the add-ons tab, and up there on the search, you can search for Node Wrangler and just checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. So the add-on is built into Blender and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So I'm just going to select this object here and I'm going to click on new to create a new material. And I can also rename the material Procedural Solar Panels. So to start off, I'm going to create kind of that grid texture with those diamond shapes. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Voronoi texture, and let's stick the Voronoi right there. And then we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, so you can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes, and that is going to add the viewer node, and it's going to preview the node on the object. And then also with the Voronoi texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl T, and this is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and this is using another feature from the Node Wrangler add-on. Now I want to use the object coordinates, so let's plug the object into the vector of this mapping node. And then we can use the mapping node later on to scale the entire material, so I will leave the mapping node here, and the vector from the mapping node is going to go into the vector of the Voronoi. Now right here on this bottom dropdown, I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to change this to the Chebyshev. So now that I've changed it to the Chebyshev, you can see we have all these little squares here. Now the squares are very random and I don't want them to be random. I want them to be straight. So let's take the randomness value right here on the Voronoi texture and let's turn this to 0. So now we have this really nice pattern here with all these squares. And then right here on the Voronoi scale, I'm just going to turn it to a value of 2. Now I want to make the squares more contrasty because right now they almost look like pyramids or something, but I want to make them more sharp so that there are these black squares with white lines. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node. We're going to stick the color ramp node right here after the Voronoi texture. So now I can drag these tabs together, and as I drag them closer and closer, it's going to make it more contrasty. And I actually want to flip these values, so I'm going to drag the white tab over here and then the black tab over here. So we have white squares with the black lines. And then I want it to be very contrasty and pretty small as well. So I'm going to drag these back here and I'm going to bring them very close to each other. So something like that is pretty good. So they're about in the center, and the white and the black tabs are very close to each other. So now you can see we have this grid texture. So now I also want to add the diamond shape, because there's kind of a diamond shape where all the lines meet. So let's do that. So I can actually use the same Voronoi texture and the color ramp. So I'm going to select the Voronoi texture, hold down the Shift key, and select the color ramp. I now want to duplicate these. So normally you can press Shift D to duplicate, but I'm going to press Control Z to undo that. I'm going to instead press Control Shift D. And because I pressed Control Shift D, it's going to duplicate the nodes but keep the wires plugged up. So now the mapping is plugged up to this Voronoi texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. Now on this bottom Voronoi, I'm going to click on the Chebyshev, and I'm going to instead change this to the Manhattan. So now you can see we have the diamond shape. Now the diamonds are kind of going through each other, so I want to drag around the color ramp to change the shape of that, and I want to make them smaller. And I also want to flip the colors so that the black is on this side, so on the left side of the color ramp. And then I'm going to drag this over and also drag the white tab over so that we have these little diamond shapes. And make sure they are pretty close so there isn't very much blending. There should just be a little bit of a color fade there from black to white, but it should be pretty sharp. So something like that is great. So I can Control Shift and select both of these, and I want to combine both of them together because we have the grid and the diamond. So I'm going to select the first color ramp, hold down the Shift key, and select the second color ramp. I can now press Control 0. So that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add this Mix RGB node, and I can click on the arrow to open this up. And let's actually box select all these nodes and kind of move them back here so we have a bit more space. So we can use the Mix RGB to mix colors together. So I want the top color ramp to go into color 1 and the bottom color ramp to go into color 2. Now I just want to add the dark values. Right now we have this factor value, but the factor value is just evenly blending between both of them. But I just want to add the black values. So I can click on the mix here and I can change this to darken, and then this way it's just going to add the dark values. So then I can turn the factor all the way up to 1, and now it's just adding all those black areas. Now there is a problem here. I want the diamonds right over here where those lines meet, and I don't really want it in the center. So right back over here, we can change the mapping and we can move the texture over so it's in the center there. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the vector math node, and let's drop the vector math node right here, and then I can kind of bring these back, bring the color ramp back, and kind of put the textures over each other. And make sure you put the vector math node between the mapping and the bottom Voronoi, because the bottom Voronoi texture is the diamond one. So these values are representing the X, Y, and Z axis, so I can drag these values and you can see that it's going to move the texture around. So I'm going to select the top value and then drag down once and then let go. And this way we can change the X and Y value at the same time. And I'm going to type in 0.75. So just 0.75. And so this way the vector math node is shifting the texture over a little bit on the X and the Y axis. And so now the diamond shapes are right there in the center where the grid meets. Now I'm going to zoom out here and I want to put all of these nodes together in a frame just to organize them very well. So I'm going to press B for the box select. I'm going to drag my mouse over all these nodes here, and then I can press Control J. So Control J is going to add this frame, and I can drag the frame around, and it's just a nice way to organize the nodes. And then with the frame selected, I can press F2, and this is going to add a label, and I can just rename this to grid texture and then hit enter. All right, so that is the grid texture, but I also want to create the blue texture. So let's do that. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search here, and I'm going to search for another Voronoi texture. Let's stick it up here. And then I want the mapping node to be able to scale the entire material. So I want every texture to be plugged up to it. And I also want all of the textures to use the object coordinates. So let's pull out a wire from the vector here on the mapping, and we're going to stick that into the vector, the Voronoi. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. And I actually want to Control Shift and select it twice so that we can preview the color value. Now on the scale here, I'm going to change the scale to 130. So now it's really small, and if you zoom in there, you can see we have all these little chunks of color. Now I want to make these colors blue so they look like solar panels. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I can search for the color ramp node, and then we're going to stick the color ramp node right in here after the Voronoi texture, and make sure the color from the Voronoi is going into the color ramp. So I can now change the colors of the color ramp, and that'll change the colors of the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to click on the black tab, and I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to make this a dark blue color. And if you'd like to use the exact same color that I'm using, then you can click right over here on the hex value, and you can punch in a hex value of 002E8D. So that is the color that I'll be using. And then I'm going to click on the white tab, and this color is going to be a similar color, so it's going to be kind of a dark blue, but it's going to be a little bit brighter and a little bit less saturated. And the exact color that I'll be using for this lighter blue, if you go over here to the hex value, you can punch in 004B9E. So that is the exact color that I'll be using. So we now have a nice texture there for the solar panels. Now I also want to add a little bit of variation, so I'm going to have some parts be a little bit darker and some parts be a little bit lighter. And this will also help the solar panels to look a little bit more worn and old, and maybe a little bit dirty as well. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture. Let's click on this noise texture, and I'm going to drop it right here above the Voronoi. And then I also want to use the object coordinates. So right here, I can actually hold down the Shift key, and I can right click and then drag over the wire and let go. And this is going to add a reroute, and I can just drag the reroute up here, and then I can pull out a wire and stick it into the noise texture. So this is basically just splitting up the wire, but it really is all coming from the mapping. So using reroutes is just a nice way to organize the nodes and make it look nicer. And then let's also organize this very well. So I'm going to press B for the box select. I'm just going to box select all these nodes here, and then to add a frame, I can press Control J. Control J is going to add a frame, and then if I select the frame, I can press F2 to rename the frame, and I can just rename this to like blue texture. All right, there we go, blue texture. So now I'm going to Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And let's change some of the values. So I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15. And then also the scale here, I'm going to turn this down to like a 2 so that those blobs of color are a little bit bigger. So I now want to combine the noise texture and the color ramp. So you can just select the noise texture, hold down the Shift key, and select the color ramp. And then I can press Control 0, and again that's using the Node Wrangler feature, and it's going to add this Mix RGB, so I can click on the Mix RGB, and I'm going to drag it inside this frame here with the blue texture, and just drag it over there. Now I actually want the noise texture to be going into the factor. And then I want this bottom color ramp here to be going into color 1. Now I just want to add the dark values because I just want to add a little bit of dark noise over this color ramp. So I'm going to click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to darken. And then if I click right here on color 2, I can change this color, and you can see if I turn it up to white, you can't see any of the noise texture, but then as I turn color 2 down, it's going to reveal more and more of the noise texture. And then I'm also going to make this a very dark blue. So I'm going to bring this over to the blue values. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using for color 2, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 13192B. So now you can see that there's some little dark areas here and there around the texture. Now I do want to make this a little bit more contrasty, so I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I can search for a color ramp, and we can stick the color ramp right here after the noise texture. So now if I take the color ramp colors, if I drag them together, it's going to be more contrasty. So I'm just going to drag this over a little bit, and then I'll also drag the white tab over a little bit. So now those little dark patches are a little bit more visible and easier to see. Now I also want to add that really small grid texture all along the material. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the brick texture. Let's click on the brick texture, and I want to stick the brick texture right here inside the blue texture frame, and then I can also like drag this up. And then just like all the other textures, I want the mapping node to be plugged into the texture, so I can just drag a wire out of the reroute and stick that into the vector of the brick texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the brick texture to preview it. So right now it looks like bricks, but I want this to look like a very small grid. So let's take color 1, we're going to make that fully black, and also color 2, we're going to make this fully black as well. And then on this mortar here, I can make this fully white. So this way all of the bricks are black and we just have that white white grid there. Now it doesn't really look like a grid, so let's take the offset and we're going to turn that to 0. So now that the offset is turned to 0, it looks just like a grid. And then to change the size of the grid, we can change the mortar size. So I'm going to change the mortar size to a 0.015. So a 0.015, and now the white lines are a bit smaller. And then I also want to make the edges a little bit more smooth. So on the mortar smooth value, I can change this to a 0.49. So just a 0.49, and now the edges are just a little bit more smooth. And then also right here on the brick width, let's change this to a 0.625. So a 0.625, and that way there will always be the same amount of vertical lines. And then on the row height here, I will just change this to a 0.2. Alright, so I now want to combine this darken with the brick texture. So I'm going to select the brick texture, hold down the shift key and select the darken, and then I can press Ctrl 0, and again that's going to add this mix RGB, and I can click on this arrow to open it up, and let's stick it right here inside this frame, and I can just bring it over. And then this is a little bit large, so I'm going to actually put the brick texture up here in between the darken and the mix, so this way it's just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to have the darken here, then I'll just bring the brick texture up here, and then the mix can be in front of the darken. And then I can just kind of drag this over and stick it down here. And maybe also bring these back a bit, just to organize my nodes a little bit better. Alright, so I'm now going to use this mix to combine the darken and the brick texture together. Now I just want to add the light values, so on the mix here I can click on this, and I'm going to change this to lighten. And then I want to take the brick texture color, and I don't want it to be going into color 2, I want the color instead to be going into the factor. And then I want the color from the darken node to be going into color 1. So now I can click on color 2 and I can change this brightness value. And if I turn color 2 all the way to 0, you can't see the brick texture at all. But then as I turn this up lighter and lighter, it's just going to add the light values. And so it's going to add more and more of the brick texture. But I don't want to make it super bright because it is very white. I just want to make it kind of a gray color. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using for color 2, you can use a hex value of 828282. So that's the gray color that I'll be using for the grid texture there. Alright, so we now have the blue texture and the grid texture, and I want to combine these together. So I'm going to drag the principled shader over here, maybe even box select these nodes and bring them up a bit so we have a bit more space. So I'm now going to select the darken from the grid texture, and I can hold down the shift key, and I'm going to select the lighten from the blue texture. And then once again, I can press Ctrl 0, and that's going to add this mix RGB. I can bring it over here and open up the mix RGB. And then I want to take this darken here from the grid texture, and I want to put that into the factor. And then I want the lighten from the blue texture to be going into color 2. So because we are using this darken here as the factor in the mix, the factor is going to tell it where the texture is going to be color 1 and where the texture is going to be color 2. And this darken here is just black and white values. So you can see that color 2 is the lighten here, so it is the blue texture. So then color 1 is going to be the grid texture. So I can click on color 1 and I can change this, and you can see it's going to change the color of the large grid. Now this large grid is going to be metal, so I want to click on color 1, and I'm just going to make this kind of a gray color. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using for the metal grid, then here on color 1 you can go to the hex and you can punch in 8C, 8C, 8C. So this is the finished color texture, so I can take the color here from the mix and I can stick that into the base color. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now I want to make this look like metal, so let's take the metallic value on the principled shader and we're going to turn the metallic all the way to 1. So now it actually looks like a metallic material. Now if I look at the side of the solar panels, you can see it's very, very smooth, and I do want it to look a little bit bumpy. So I'm going to take this grid texture and I'm going to put it into the normal to give it some bump. So let's take the color here from the darken. I'm going to stick that into the normal of the principled shader. Now you can see there's some weird shading issues. The whole texture looks really dark, and that is because this is color data, so it's a yellow dot, but then this right here is normal data and it's a purple dot. So we can't mix these two together. We need a node in here to convert the color data into normal data. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a bump node, and the bump node will convert the color data to normal data. So we're going to stick this right in here between the darken and the normal. And then to actually convert it to normal data, we want to put this into the height value of the bump. So now if you kind of look here on the side and zoom up close, it actually looks like those metal pieces are popping out of the mesh a bit. And then I also want to click on the invert button, and that way instead of it looking like it's going in, it looks like it's popping out. Now you can see that the other smaller grid is perfectly flat, and that's because we haven't added it into the bump. So I actually want to add it into the bump as well. So to do this, let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Mix RGB, and I'm just going to stick the Mix RGB right here between the darken and the bump. So the brick texture is what's creating the smaller grid. So I can take the color from the brick texture, and I'm going to bring the wire down here, and I'm going to stick it into the factor of this mix here, which is right before the bump. And then again, I just want to add the dark values. So on the mix here, I can click on this, and I'm just going to change this to darken. And then the darken from the grid texture is going to go into color 1. So I can now click on color 2, and I'm going to make this fully dark. So now you can see that the smaller grid also looks like it's popping out of the mesh. And if I Control Shift and select the darken, you can see that's what we've created. So basically we have joined the brick texture and the grid texture together with this darken. And then that is going to go into the bump node. So if I Control Shift and select the bump node, you can see what we've created. So this is the normal map. So you can see what is popping out of the mesh. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. And then also if you want to organize the nodes very well, you can select the darken, hold down the Shift key and select the bump, and then you can press Control J. Control J is going to add another frame, and then if you select the frame, you can press F2 to rename the frame, and I'm going to rename it to bump. So now the label says bump. So this is looking pretty cool, and we are almost done with this material, but I do want to have some variation in the roughness. So right here, there's a roughness value on the principled shader, and if I turn this way down, it's going to be very shiny and reflective, kind of like a mirror. And so I do want it to be more reflective, but I want some parts to be a little bit more shiny and other parts to be a little bit more rough. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and we're going to bring the noise texture way down here underneath the grid texture. And then just like all the other textures, I want the mapping node to be plugged into it. So let's pull out a wire from the vector, and I'm going to stick this into the vector of the noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So now let's change some of the values. So I'm going to turn the scale here to like A6, and then I want this to be very detailed. So let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15. And then I do want to add a little bit more roughness. So let's turn the roughness value to a 0.55. So I can now pull out a wire from the noise texture factor, and I'm going to stick this into the roughness value of the principled shader. So instead of using a single value, the noise texture is going to control the roughness of the material. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview that. And I'm going to bring the noise texture over so it's a little bit closer, and then you can see this wire is overlapping. So if you want to, you can hold down the Shift key and you can right click and drag and then let go. That's going to add a reroute, and I can just bring the reroute over. All right, now I want more control over this because right now that's actually looking pretty rough, and I do want it to be more shiny. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp and just click on the color ramp, and I'm going to stick the color ramp right here after the noise texture. So I can now use the color ramp to change the colors, and that'll change how shiny the material is. So I first want it to be a bit more contrasty, so I'm going to drag the black tab over a bit, and you can see that now some parts are more shiny. Now if I make the values lighter, the material is going to be more rough. So I can click on the black tab here, and I can turn this up and make it more of a gray color, and you can see it's going to make the material more rough. And if you want to use the exact same value that I'm using right here on this color ramp color, I'm going to be using a hex value of 3F, 3F, 3F. And then I do want to make the white tab a little bit darker so that it's a bit more shiny all over the place. So I'm going to click on the white tab right here, and I can make this a little bit darker. And the hex value that I'm going to be using is F4, F4, F4. So now the solar panels are much more reflective, and there's also a lot of variation. So you can see there's some little parts here and there where it's more rough, and then other parts where it's more shiny. And then again, if you want to keep your nodes very organized, you can press B for the box select, just box select all these nodes here. So the color ramp, the noise texture, and the reroute. And then you can press Control J, and that is going to add this frame here. I'll just bring the frame down, and then I can press F2 to rename this, and I'm just going to rename this to roughness because this is controlling the roughness. So that is it. That is the procedural solar panel material. Now there is one more thing that I want to show you. I want to show you how you can change the size of the entire material. So the mapping node is plugged into all the textures. So if I change the scale of the mapping node, that's going to change the scale of the entire material. Now I want to change all the scale values at once. So I could click and then drag down and then drag back and forth, and that's going to change the scale values all at once. But I can also press Shift A. I can go here to the search, and I can search for the value node. Let's drop the value node here, and then I can plug the value node into the scale. So this way, this one single value will control all of the X, Y, and Z scale. So I'm just going to turn this to 1. I think 1 looks pretty good for this object, but of course, depending on the size of your object and the size of the solar panel, you can just drag the value node around, and that's going to change the size of the material. And there is the final render. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel, then you can purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store, and you also get access to it if you join my Patreon page. And those are great ways to help support me and this channel. And if you'd like to help support the channel here on YouTube, you can also check out the YouTube memberships by clicking on the join button right down there next to the subscribe button. And if you join the YouTube memberships, then you'll be helping to support the channel each month, and you'll get some cool perks here on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to give me a little tip, you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube, and I do appreciate your support. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials, and if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. Links are in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching.